the second episode of the Churn. Today we have two very distinguished international guests with us. We have with us Ofir Haivry. Ofir Haivry is associated with the Berg Foundation. He's also a part of the Herzl Institute, a think tank based out of Israel. We also have with us Yoram Hazony, whose book, The Virtue of Nationalism, has taken the international academic and media space by the storm. He has created a movement of sort with his amazing book that tries to defend nationalism in the current contextual globe order. Now, Yoram, I would like to begin with you. How do you see this entire situation with respect to the COVID crisis, the international organizations which are, for the lack of a better word, actually failing to bring together any sense of semblance, the kind of order that they laid out on the world, and you've reflected a lot on the book, the values that they sort of nurtured, all of that is breaking down. How do you look at this entire global situation?
There's been an argument, I think, at least since the 1990s, about whether we would all benefit if we cease to consider the world as a world of independent nations and instead move towards some kind of global governance where there would be a coming together of people from all nations to take responsibility for solving the problems of the world. The slogan has been, there are many global problems, and global problems need a global solution. And obviously, this turn to globalism has been modeled on the European Union, which has been at the vanguard of removing international borders and trying to treat the different nations as though they are all part of one kind of homogeneous humanity. And I think that it's certainly too early to judge the COVID crisis and its consequences. I don't think any of us know how this is going to end, but some things are already very clear. A globalist economy, which is one in which it doesn't make any difference whether all of the medication in the world is based on Chinese manufacturing, because maybe that's the least expensive way to do it. This is obviously a question that's been raised and will continue to be raised.
Right. So, Ofir, when Samuel Huntington wrote his book, he talked about, very derisively, he talked about a concept called the Davos dudes. Now, the Davos dudes and the dudettes have been politically beaten globally. They don't have a narrative that can sustain whatever high-profile intellect that they used to talk about. And with this context, the global context of Corona and COVID crisis in mind, the institutions that they created are also under a radar of complete depletion. How do you interpret this situation? And do you feel like Yoram said, that there's still a lot that we need to absorb to be able to make a comment?
Well, clearly, the current crisis highlights, I think, one main point, that even when a problem is global, and in a sense, this is the most global problem ever, there was no war or anything close to it, the solutions are, of course, always local, because sadly, there's no one solution that can work all over. And we see a lot of differences between different approaches, and some places more successful, from some places less successful. But even more than that, I think that first of all, it highlights how much everyone of us wants to basically at least believe that he's willing to help everyone else in the world. But in practice, and this is not only theoretically but also practically a true thing, that we always want to help those who are closest to us, who we are willing to sacrifice things for. And in a sense, I can say that a national state, a country which is a nation, is the largest conglomeration of human beings in which this thing exists. This is why basically within such countries, people are willing, not because some ruler told them, and not because a party made them do this, but because they are willing to sacrifice things for others. And naturally, all of us would be really ready to sacrifice, I don't know, very little for someone who doesn't know, but most of us are willing to sacrifice a lot, I think, for those who we feel connected and we have loyalty to. And so, in this sense, this crisis, I think, shows that the nation and the local and thus the nation are the essential tool to solve this problem and probably most other problems.
Right, right. So one of the viewers sent a question, and any one of you, can pitch in to answer this question. Many analysts believe that the surge of populism and nationalism would happen in this post-COVID world. Why do you see that analysts are actually pinning down to this analysis? And also the fact that there are very few conservative political movements who've been able to sustain themselves for a long time. In fact, in case of Hungary, we saw how dictators have usurped a populist movement. How do you see this development?
Yoram, do you want to answer? Want me to answer?
I just want to say with regard to Hungary that, again, I would suggest that we be careful about drawing sweeping conclusions on the basis of things that happen in the news day to day. I don't know what's going to happen in Hungary, but until the crisis passes and we see the way that Prime Minister Orban handles the transition back to normal democratic rule, and until we see the way that other countries handle the transition back to normal democratic rule, I would be careful about deciding who the bad guys and who the good guys are right now.
Right. Ofir, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to note that I think that probably this happens also in India, but I can tell you for sure that in Israel, for instance, and in the US, the liberal media is arguing that Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump are kind of dictators. They are doing that liberty is in danger and so on. So these arguments actually exist everywhere because the curtailing of liberties in emergencies is always what happens. The question is not if for a month or two there is a problem, but what happens afterwards. The point is, to me, ironic because since I read in the liberal media for years that Modi and Orban and Netanyahu are already dictators, how come they can be accused now of being dictators because they were already before? So what's changed? But suddenly, that's something that you can always argue. In 1 year they will say no, it's really a dictatorship in whatever, in India, in Hungary. So I'm very skeptical about it.
Right. So Yoram, your book very passionately argues for the cause of nationalism. In fact, you go on to say that we do not need a global order of sorts, which is based on universal principles, and you very clearly demarcated that in your book. In this current situation, when the entire world is facing this kind of crisis, if I were to make an argument from your book as to what is the solution next, how do you see this entire situation spanning out? For example, if India has a problem, Israel has a problem, Pakistan has a problem, and China has a problem, and we all get together on a table and talk things out, is it no longer the question anymore?
No, I think the main question that I emphasized in my book, and I think is completely relevant, is whether, first of all, factually, do we live in a competitive world, in a world of competing nations, Or do we live in a world where competition is this kind of primitive thing that we can simply overcome and eliminate? And as Dr. Haivry said, we can see very clearly in the current crisis that it is, as a matter of fact, a competitive world, that the Italians may have expected the Germans to come and rescue them, but the Germans have their own problems, and they're not coming and rescuing the Italians. And every nation is, to a certain extent, looking out for itself. And to begin with, that's the reality. The next question we need to ask is, all right, if that's the reality, maybe we can take advantage of that reality in order to achieve collective ends. And I think this crisis is a good example. Would we be better off if there were a Central European style government that was making decisions for all the healthcare systems in the world? Right. Let's just take the search for a vaccine. At the moment, every country is searching for a vaccine on its own. Collaborations are in theory possible, but really what's happening is that governments and private corporations are competing with one another for the prestige of developing a vaccine in order to help their own people, in order to make a tremendous profit off of the vaccine as soon as they develop it. And this competition strikes me as being both a very good example of nationalism, the way that, as Dr. Haivry said, the way that people tend to want to make the extra effort on behalf of their own people rather than on behalf of the world. And at the same time, we see that, well, again, we'll know once it's all over, we'll know how it turned out. But if I might make a prediction, I think that it will be pretty clear to us, once it's all over, that the search for original treatments and vaccines and methods of testing in real time gained an advantage from the fact that many different countries were competing in order to try to do it, rather than allowing, let's say, the World Health Organization to make the decisions, which would have simply been a situation in which whoever had influence in the World Health Organization, let's say it was the Chinese, then they would have been making the decisions for everyone.
Right. Based on what Ofir's, spoke, the previous comment that Ofir made, it is extremely interesting that despite the fact that the liberal world order has collapsed and the fact that the last remnants and vestiges or proponents of the liberal world order still reside in the New York Times and the Washington Post of the world, the point of the matter is that still we are talking, we are giving a counter narrative to what they have been misinforming and misguiding world over in terms of narrative setting. But for example, the kind of work that you've done, Yoram, the kind of movement that you have generated out of the ideas that your book pronounces, how are we going to institutionalize this movement? Do you see an international collaboration of sort which can do this? Because world over, this rise of populism / nationalism, which is often conflated and wrongfully so, how do you see all of this tying together? Do you see the need for an institution building exercise?
Well, I don't see any problem with international institutions. My problem is with trying to give them the authority and the power to be able to coerce nations. So the idea that people who are like-minded from around the world get together to discuss physics or medicine, or in the case that you're discussing, political ideas, I don't see anything wrong with it. It's actually immensely useful to be able to learn from people from other nations. The problem that I emphasize in the book is the theory that the independent nation, that a nation such as India or Britain or Italy or Israel or the United States should give its authorities over to an international body, which then has the authority and the power to coerce these nations, right? That is what we used to call an empire, and the threat of an empire to the independence and self-determination and freedom of nations is one that people in India should be able to understand and identify with. So to answer your particular question, here we have a case of national conservatives in many different countries. And we're discovering that national conservatives in different countries share a great deal, that our experiences dealing with the liberal imperialist media and the liberal academia, which is basically a single international cartel, and our problems with our judicial systems, because the courts in different countries have taken up the habit of referring to one another as though they are not independent nations, but rather as though there's a kind of universal natural law that all court systems need to adopt as the true constitution. These kinds of problems are problems in which we've found in the Edmund Burke Foundation that when we meet with people from different countries and we explain our experiences and we hear what people from other countries are going through, first of all, we learn things that we didn't know. And second, we gain strength from being able to see that it's not simply, liberal ideas or Marxist ideas that have some kind of meaning for people in different countries. It is meaningful to sit in a room with people from many different nations and find out that we do share something in common. But that doesn't mean that our international meetings need to turn into a new world government. I think we'd be best without that.
Right. Ofir, you've been a historian. I just want to build on what Yoram said and ask you, in this current situation where we see an intellectual apartheid of sorts, where we see that top academic institutions world over, they're completely impervious to the other point of view. We all of us as scholars, all of us as academicians, all of us as writers have faced this kind of boycott with respect to any point of view that does not match the so-called liberal world order. And this is a problem world over. So where do you see the intellectual challenge actually residing? And how do you, as a historian and an academic yourself, how do you propose a way forward from here?
Well, first of all, the situation is not totally new, because I'm old enough to remember when I was just starting the university, I caught the last waves of the current consensus, not total consensus, but still, basically all over the West, there was a kind of, I would say, sort of Marxist, leftist consensus, where most universities had a majority, in many places, a totality of academics who were believed in some version of Marxism. This is the future. And at that time, they were all arguing for against empires, because they believed that in the future there would be a world order that would not be called an empire, but actually it would be a communist or Marxist world order. Now, because the communist bloc felt, there was I think, a kind of a transmission into a kind of liberal, progressive universalism. But basically, it remained the same thing. The universities are wed to an idea of basically the same ideas in other clothes. So I would say there are two levels here. First, clearly, we have the downside intellectually, because most people today that have went through education in the university have been educated that all the important things about the particular, meaning our religion, our state, our nation, our whatever, are, you know, at best, it's a nice folkloristic things. But you cannot draw, for instance, from your own religion or tradition into your politics and so on. So everything has to be kind of neutral. And so if everything is neutral, really, you don't need different states. Because if everything is neutral, there will be no difference really between India, Israel, and Britain. Right. But the ironic thing is that, you know, historically, Israel and India and Britain were, until 70 years ago, part of the same empire. And at that time, things were decided in London, right? For everywhere. And so since, for some reason, I think a good reason, people understood that this is not a good order of things. Now, it's ironic that there is a will to, you know, go back to some version of that. So basically, one is there should be a major intellectual renaissance of, you know, national conservative ideas. But I tell you the truth, I'm not sure if in the existing universities that is possible, because it's a work for generations. And at the Edmund Bank Fund, we're trying to, you know, to start this with books, with conferences. We hope in the future to have a conference maybe in India, and so on.
Yes, and we'll ensure that we do this very soon. Yoram, in your book, you have a very nostalgic recall for anti-imperialist freedom movement. Especially, say, for example, you have mentioned Mahatma Gandhi's call for freedom. So, and how do you propose to defend your theory in the wake of the current revolt against the liberal imperialist world order? Apart from non-interference by global agencies, which you have succinctly explained even during this conversation, what is it that we are proposing on the table? What is it that you say that nationalism in 2020, what exactly does it look like?
Well, it's going to look different in every country. I mean, but part of the, maybe the major difference between nationalism and conservatism on the one hand, and Marxism or liberalism on the other, is that Marxism and liberalism really are universal theories. They're universal doctrines. Right. A person who is a Marxist or a liberal is someone who believes that they have the basic answers for how everything should run in every country in the world, and it's always the same answer, you know, which is very nice for you if you have the answers for how the whole world should run at all times and places in history. Right. But the cornerstone of a conservative worldview is the understanding that all of us are limited, and we all tend to think that we have the right answer, and often we're very wrong about it. And so, going back to the Hebrew Bible, which is, you know, kind of the source of these ideas in the Christian West and certainly in Israel. The idea of the prophets is that there should be many different nations, because each nation will approach God from a different perspective, and each nation will approach the truth from a different perspective. That doesn't mean that there is no truth. It means that the truth is difficult for us as human beings to find. So on this view, each nation becomes a kind of an experiment in trying to find the truth and trying to do things in different ways. That means that I don't feel that the need to tell you exactly what India should look like. I know a little bit about a few countries in America, Europe, and Israel. I can say a couple of things about them, but the principal idea is that the traditions that are inherited in each country are traditions which are the result of a different approach to the truth. That is, a different attempt to get to the truth. And if someone comes from the outside and tells you, "Oh, listen, I was in a university in Germany or in London or in New York, and there they said, we should overthrow all of our traditions because we have the truth, because we have liberalism or Marxism," then I would say, without knowing that much about India and its traditions, that I can immediately say, well, I would be very skeptical I am very skeptical about the idea that a country with traditions that are 3,000 or 4,000 years old should immediately overthrow them because someone studied liberalism in a Western university. Right? So to begin with, before anything else, it's tendency to say that it's likely that Indian traditions and Hindu traditions have truths and importance to them that should make you want to, in the first instance, to defend them and protect them. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that conservative thinkers are not they're not idolaters of the past. Conservative thinkers, the great thinkers for example, in the Anglo-American conservative tradition, thinkers such as Selden and Burke or Montesquieu in France, these are thinkers who understand that nothing can remain exactly the same forever. That the purpose of the conservative is not to keep things unchanged and completely unchanged, because things do change, and in order to survive, a country does need to adapt. But the question is, when you're adapting, are you adapting by overthrowing everything from the past because you have something new, or are you looking carefully at other nations and other traditions and saying, well, look, let's see, our neighbors do have some advantages that we don't have. Maybe we should experiment by adopting some of their ideas, and then we'll see what happens. That gives us the opportunity to try to see whether something might work, and then to go back if it doesn't.
I'm quoting from Yoram's book, Ofir. He mentions Islam, Marxism, and liberalism, and says that liberal imperialist political ideals have become among the most powerful agents fomenting intolerance and hate in the Western world today. Now, I want you to specifically comment on this as a historian. What is this nefarious connection between communism and Islam?
Well, first of all, Islam, or at least some version of Islam, and communism and liberalism, they share the one notion that they have a magical solution that is perfect for everyone. Now, of course, that I think that every culture thinks that it has some very good answers to the problems of the world, but most cultures do not think that their own solution for their own problems is automatically exportable as is to another place. So basically, if in Israel our tradition allows us to tackle the coronavirus in a good way, it doesn't mean that it would work in India. Maybe India could learn from us or not. Maybe we can learn from India again. But there are some ideologies which you mentioned three of them, which they have a kind of not only universal but also a purist, like something that the only way to achieve the goal is to remain universally pure. So not only they believe in a universal answer for everything, but also that it has to actually fight against local characteristics. So unfortunately, this means that those ideologies they feel that even if they have the answers, the fact that in other places people don't adopt them, they are somehow either misguided or evil. And for this reason, you see, I didn't see any Hindu terrorists attacking Afghanistan and Pakistan, or capitalist terrorists trying to attack China. So India finds itself at the moment under pressure, I think clearly from Islamic extremists and from communist extremists. And I think also from liberals. Of course, they don't need to use violence, but they are actually attacking the institutions of India, like of course, in different ways. They're attacking the institution of Israel and other democratic countries, because for them, the fact that a particular answer seems to succeed is for them like putting a nail in their eye. It undermines the whole view. If India or Israel or another country would actually be very successful in its own way, it would imply that maybe they don't need Islam, maybe they don't need communism. And so this is the reason that why the liberals, not only the imperialists and so on, they don't only think you are wrong, but they feel that they have to make you conform to their ideas.
Which is why I think it's very easy to dismiss any movement any grassroots movement which takes into account the voice of the majority, dismiss it as populist, dismiss it as very derisively as nationalist, and build an entire movement around very selectively chosen words and words that have a lot of currency among millennials. One of the other things which I wanted to ask, and both
did you say millennials?
Yes, and I'm going to yes.
Are there millennials in India too?
Obviously there are.
I thought there were millennials only in America and Europe.
No. There is a certain section of youngsters in India which identifies very, very strongly by calling themselves millennials, and it's a question which I must ask, which has come to us in many different formats. There is a large section of youth, let me not call them millennials, a large section of youth which is absolutely disgusted by the leftist ideology. But there's also a section which is feeling absolutely at loss with this new populist, for the lack of a better word, sentiment, which is becoming very, very territorial in its orientation. So what message do you as academicians, as public intellectuals have for these youngsters who are in search for truth, but are definitely not finding it in the larger imperial, global, leftist, liberal framework, and are finding a lot of problems in associating themselves with this brand of nationalism, which comes with its own set of problems?
Well, on my part, first of all, I don't know any political movement, ideology, idea even that has no problems, that does not exist. Okay, the fact that I like the family as an institution, it doesn't mean that all families are perfect, far from it. So this is the first thing. I don't want to say that nationalism or conservatism has no problem, but the main point is that I think it has to be conceptual. So the term populism now means, I don't know what it means. Does the populist movement in Hungary is the same as the so-called populist movement in India, or Trump is like Netanyahu? The only meaning is one. Those who mean populist mean that it's democratic, meaning that those so-called populists are people who win elections. Oh my God, they win elections when they're supposed to lose them because the truth is on the other side. So it's clearly populists are only people who win elections. And we have to understand that really the national conservatives at this point are far more democratic in their ideas than a liberal outlook that really says, if you vote our way, it's okay. If you vote the other party, you're populist, because there are no two options. There's only one right option and the other one is evil.
Let me add something about democracy. In order to the advantage of a democratic form of government is that parties that would otherwise need to resort to violence, to killing one another in order to solve their problems, in a democracy, they agree not to kill one another in order to have domestic peace, right? So the deal in any democracy is that that the different parties grant one another legitimacy, meaning I say to you, I may not agree with you at all, but you have the right to win an election. And if you win an election, I will let you govern. I won't try to prevent you from governing the country. And in exchange, when I win the election, you will grant me legitimacy and you won't prevent me from governing. But notice that advantage of democracy depends entirely on each party being willing to tolerate the others. And what we've seen in recent years is a frightening disintegration of the capacity of liberals to grant legitimacy to anyone who's not a liberal. Right? There's all sorts of good reasons for this historically, but the most important thing for your young people is to notice that liberals are no longer tolerant. They're not willing to tolerate and to grant legitimacy to people who don't agree with them, which means that liberals are moving away from the possibility of a democratic form of government. So if you, as I do, think that India is probably better off with a democracy, and that Israel is better off with a democracy, then that means that we have to be looking for a way to reinstate the mutual legitimacy and toleration between competing political parties. And today, the most important force in the world for allowing legitimacy to many different points of view is nationalist. I agree with Haivry that there's no perfect political worldview, but today in our world, tolerance is a nationalist virtue, because the nationalists in Hungary, whatever you may think of them, they don't have any kind of plan to conquer India and tell people in India what to do, right? And just like the nationalists in India, as far as I know, are not yet trying to conquer Israel, right? So see, I make you laugh, but that's the truth. That's what makes it possible for us to be very good partners, because you're not interested in conquering us, and we're not interested in conquering you. We share an opponent or an enemy, which is people who want to conquer the whole world and make your worldview and mine illegitimate.
In fact, I wanted to ask any one of you, again, are free to answer this question. What do you see? How do you read this surge of nationalism in India? What is your worldview on that?
Well, on my part, it's basically a result of the fact that I would say the mainstream left 60, 70, 8 years ago was also nationalist. Basically, nationalism was shared, with variants and so on, but basically social democratic parties all over the world were nationalist to some version. The same, it was shared by 80 or 90% actually of parties. And what happened in the last 2 generations, that basically the left gradually became ultra-universalist. There was created a very small class of people who are like cosmopolists, in the mean that they think that they can work today in India and tomorrow in New York and after that in France. And so there's no meaning to countries and so on. And these kind of people slowly, in a sense, destroyed the nationalist component on the left. So what happened is that this didn't emerge at one moment, but it was basically a generation where gradually the left, which in many countries, including India and Israel, had ruled for 2 generations with this combination of I would say, mild nationalism and some kind of social democracy, something like that. It basically left that, and it expected the population to follow wherever. What happened actually was the population eventually said, I don't want that. I think that I am Indian / Israeli / American. I don't belong to someone, John Lennon imagined nowhere place where everyone is the same. I don't imagine a place where there's no religion. I want my own religion, and he can have his own religion and so on. And so what I think is happening in India is the same thing that is happening in Israel, in Hungary, and many other places. People are saying, we are rejecting basically this idea that the only way to be decent human beings is to give up on everything that makes us what we are.
Right. Have you guys traveled to India? Any of you or both of you?
No, we're waiting for an invitation.
Sorry. Yeah. No, my mother used to live in India many years ago, but I wasn't there.
Okay. I hope that we sail through this COVID crisis and we successfully, emerge victorious in this battle against Corona. And I definitely invite both of you to come visit India, stay with us. And I hope to have these conversations with you more and more often. And let's also hope that we have a global conference on conservatism hosted in India, and we'll try and work something out. Thank you, both of you, for giving your valuable time. Thank you for
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
God bless you.